then I want to introduce to you yet again Dr. Peter August, who will introduce to you our dear friend and beloved science advisor, Dr. Peter Payton.
Thank you, Deborah. Deborah decided to keep this part of the meeting limited to the Peters of the audience here. Peter Payton, Peter Gummis, and myself. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Peter Payton. He's a colleague of mine at URI. He's a distinguished professor of ornithology in the Department of Natural Resources Science, and he is without doubt the state and the region's go-to senior ornithologist. If you have bird issues, Peter is the guy that you go to. His research portfolio now is incredibly diverse. He is a leader of the Bird Atlas that we heard from Dr. Clarkson about in the Landfear Live session. He's been very active in understanding the relationship between offshore wind turbines and flight patterns of migratory birds. We're going to hear about his piping plover work tonight, and he's been very active with sea duck research. Over the course of his career, his research has taken him to Hawaii, where he studied rare and endangered Hawaiian birds, Alaska, where he developed protocols to inventory bird life in Alaska, California to study impacts of forestry, tree cutting protocols with owls and other birds. Colorado, New England, his work has taken him all over the place. He's published over 100 papers and book chapters. At URI, he teaches field ornithology, wetland wildlife management, and migratory species management. I'm very proud to also point out in terms of teaching, Peter is a legend among our students. They love his classes, and a couple of years ago he was voted the Teacher of the Year Award for the College of the Environment. He's really a very gifted mentor. He served as a science advisor for the Napa Tree Point Conservation Area for the last 8 years. He's been incredibly generous with his time, and I now want to turn this over to my friend and colleague Peter Payton, who's going to share with us some details on piping plover ecology. Peter.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I'm honored to be part of the group and talk to you about one of my passions is shorebirds and piping plovers. So what I want to do tonight is give you a brief introduction to the breeding biology of piping plovers, and then talk about some of the research that I've conducted on piping plovers. And if you look really closely at this picture of this bird, you can see this minute antenna on the back of this bird that actually I put a transmitter on this bird, and I'll talk about that in the second part of my talk. So many of you, most of you have seen piping plover, maybe you all haven't. A lot of you, anytime you go to the beach in the Atlantic coast, you see these signs telling you to stay out of these areas. They're sensitive to disturbance, and so we want to protect these birds, and I'll talk about the reasons why in a little bit. So plovers are a group of shorebirds that all look similar. So this just shows some of the species of plovers that we have in North America. To give you an idea, the species I'm talking about today is in the center of this slide. The species in the upper left-hand corner is a snowy plover, which I did my PhD on at the Great Salt Lake. The one with the big nose is next to it. In the upper middle, that's a Wilson's plover. That's, if you go to the southern United States, that's a more common species. A similar species, the left-hand middle row, is Semi-Palmated Plover, which is a species we get as a migrant, but they breed in the high Arctic. And the lower rows, black-bellied plover and American golden plover, they also breed in the high Arctic, but they migrate through our Napa tree and then killed there, you see it around the fields. But they all have these similar features. It's relatively blunt bill, cryptic plumage. So plovers, all of the plovers, the way they get around is they're fast runners. And if you see them on the beaches, they're highly mobile, but running around. And this is the way you constantly see them. Their plumage, though, is very cryptic, so they blend into the background of the beach. And they run around the beaches and they glean insects off the surface of substrate. So they're going after beetles and ants and other things. Occasionally, they might probe a little bit into the substrate and get something like this polychaete worm to grab it, but they don't probe very much into the substrate. They're mainly just getting stuff off the surface of the substrate. Now, when plovers, they winter farther south than I'll talk about later on, but they start to arrive in Rhode Island, the males first in about the middle of March. The females start to arrive by the end of March. And then they're highly territorial, so they go through these major battles, the males do, to establish the territories. And the territories can be anywhere from, along the beach, anywhere from every 50 to 100 meters in areas with high density. And the males will establish their boundaries and walk up and down the boundaries and defend that territory from other males. And they do this elaborate courtship flight too, which hence their name, Charadrius melodus, or the piping plover. And that courtship flight is what you see. Eventually, the females, and they go through a pre-copulation display. That's the female on the right and the male on the left, and he does all this high stepping, kind of hypnotizes the female, and then copulation takes place. And then this is the only legal sex that can take place at Napatri on the beach. These are piping plovers copulating, the male on top. And I pointed this out just because you can tell the male from the female, because the male has a brighter colored bill and has that broader black band on the forehead compared to the female. So notice the female, it's duller orange and the thinner band on the top of the head. So then after copulation, they deposit 4 eggs. It takes them about 6 days, about every 50 hours, they deposit an egg, and the clutch size is almost always 4. And both the males and the females incubate. They incubate. Once the last egg is deposited, they initiate incubation. They prefer to nest in areas where it's open habitat, so they have a good view of the surrounding area. So if there's any predator coming, they can leave the nest. But again, you can see they're highly cryptic. And then the amazing thing is, even though these eggs are deposited about 50 hours apart, they all hatch within 4 to 8 hours of each other. So all 4 eggs hatch within about an 8-hour period. And the chicks are just happy to be out of that egg. They're just jump with joy. But the amazing thing about the piping plover chicks is that they're precocial, meaning that they're capable of running right away, immediately, feeding on their own. And so they take care of themselves almost immediately within a few hours of leaving the nest. This is a chick that's a little bit older, but again, they're highly mobile. If they can get through that first week of life, they have a really good chance of surviving till fledging or being capable of flight. So as I mentioned earlier, the chicks feed for themselves. The parents don't have to feed the chicks. And so they're moving around, and the role of the parents is just to keep them out of trouble. And the parents are always nearby, and if there's some potential threat nearby, they'll give a call, and the chicks will freeze in place to probably minimize predation rates. And then, sometimes the adult will say there's trouble nearby, and all the chicks will run and hide underneath the parents, or they'll also, at nighttime, for thermal regulation, they'll keep the chicks protected from weather events as well, too. Then eventually, both the male and the female incubate and take care of the young, and eventually they're capable of flight or fledging. So the incubation period takes about 28 days, takes them about 25 days for them to be capable of sustained flight. And then this is a young piping plover. So they look similar to the adults, but it doesn't have that distinctive black band in the neck or the head as well, too. So highly cryptic. There's actually 3 populations of piping plovers in North America. In northern Great Plains, that population is listed as threatened. There's about 2,500 pairs. In the Great Lakes, they're actually listed as endangered, and there's 75 pairs. And then along the Atlantic coast, there's about 2,000 pairs, and they also are federally listed as threatened. So they're under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and in Rhode Island, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is what manages piping plovers. If you look at the history of piping plovers within Rhode Island, you can see the number of pairs has increased from about 10 pairs in 1986, reached a peak in about 2015 of almost 100 pairs, and there's been a slight decline over the last 5 years to about 80 pairs in the state right now. So it's still been a really successful conservation strategy to maintain piping plovers with all these roped-in areas and protecting individual nests. So I've been interested in plovers for over 30 years, and I just got involved in piping plover research in Rhode Island in about 2016. And we were interested in the movements of piping plovers, and to do that, we put up these miniature radio tags. So the lower left hand in the hand, you can get some idea of the size of these transmitters. They weigh, in the case of the one we put on piping plovers, weighs about 1 gram. You can also put them on warblers that only weigh 0.3 grams. The amazing thing about this technology, it emits a signal every 5 to 10 seconds, and that can last for, depending on the transmitter and what you put on, up to 100, in the case of piping plovers, 140 days. So it emits this continuous signal. And then you'll also notice that in the case of piping plovers, we also put these green flags on it with 3 numbers so we can recognize individuals. And then a blue band telling people that it was banded in Rhode Island or Massachusetts. So the unique thing about these transmitters is we have a series of, what's called the MODIS network, and there's over 1,000 towers around the world right now in 7 continents. And each of these towers is a very high frequency tower to detect these transmitters. And this just shows the locations of some of the towers in the Northeast and North America to track the movements of birds. And bats as well too, and insects. Anything with a transmitter, these towers will pick them up. So just to give you some idea of what these data will tell us, this is just an example of a piping plover we put a tag on. We know that it left Aquidneck Island this is on the 4th of July. It initiated migration about 7:42 p.m., circled around, and then flew north of Block Island and then south of Montauk. So it took him about an hour to do that flight, flying at about 80 kilometers per hour. So we could track the individual flight pattern of that bird based on this system of towers. So if you take all the tracks of the birds we tagged over a couple of years, this shows the departure directions of the birds from Rhode Island. And we were interested in the potential impact of offshore wind on piping plovers. So those green blocks and yellow blocks are wind lease areas off the coast of Long Island and Rhode Island. And you can see that the birds leaving Rhode Island, they don't go along Long Island Sound. They go on this northern edge of it, they go on the southern edge of it off of Montauk. And the birds leaving Massachusetts, they essentially migrate due south from those areas. So they don't hug the coast like we thought they might be doing. And if you look at the long-term tracks of these birds that we tracked, and each of those dots represent individual towers, you can see the birds from Rhode Island, they essentially leave Rhode Island, head down to New Jersey, Delaware, or Maryland in a direct flight, and the birds from Massachusetts do a direct flight all the way down to as far as North Carolina. So that's about anywhere from an 8 to a 13-hour flight that they take directly from our area down to the Mid-Atlantic region. And I also mentioned that we have a lot of color-banded birds too. And so lots of people are out birding, and we have these flags, and we can look at movements of flagged individuals. And these are just observations, and these back up what we've seen, that a lot of the birds are seen in North Carolina, so that's a really critical area. At Cape Hatteras area, a lot of these birds stage at Cape Hatteras. after fall migration, and then some of them go down to as far as Florida during that period from July through October. So that just shows the number of individuals and from what state they were detected in. So just an example, here's a bird that I tagged in Rhode Island in May, and it was seen in July in New Jersey. You can still see the antenna attached to that bird. And just an example of how site faithful are these different sites. So here's a bird that we tagged in Rhode Island, and it was seen every single fall in Ocracoke in North Carolina. So they're very site faithful, or they show up the same time every year to those stopover sites in North Carolina. And in the fall, we detected 55% of the birds we flagged in Rhode Island and 40% in Massachusetts. So a lot of these birds are resighted. Then in the winter months, from November to March, you can see that these birds move even farther south. So they move from North Carolina, and the bulk of them have been resighted in the Bahamas and also Turks and Caicos. So the birds that we have breeding in Rhode Island, for the most part, are wintering in the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos. So here's an individual that, like Cumberland Island in Georgia, VNC was its code, and it's been seen every single year from 2016, 17, 18, 19, and 20. It was just seen a few days ago. So they're very site faithful to their wintering grounds as well too. And then just here's another example of one, a bird that was seen in the Turks and Caicos, and it was a bird that was initially nested here, X2A, and then it moved, and that individual was seen in the winters of 2016, 17, 18. So again, they're very site faithful to their wintering grounds based on all these observations. So just like a lot of you like to go south in the summer months, and the piping plovers like to do the same thing exactly too. So one of the interesting questions is, why did they go from Rhode Island to stage in North Carolina and do that flight down to the Bahamas? Well, they need to do things. They need to gain fat, and they also need to molt. That's when their molt takes place, to replace their flight feathers. So they do the flight, as I just mentioned earlier, of about 500 miles to North Carolina, stage there for about 5 or 6 weeks, and then they do another flight of about another 750 miles to the Bahamas, or even going down to Turks and Caicos is about another 1,000 miles. So pretty incredible migration that these birds are capable of doing. And just as another example, that Modus network, piping plovers aren't the only species that have those tags on them. There's a lot of other species, and I mentioned Semi-Palmated Plover at the outset, and they breed in northern Canada. A number of them were tagged in James Bay, and some of the birds that were tagged were detected at the tower at Napatree, and so we get direct movements. They were tagged on the 3rd of August, and they were detected about a week later at Napatree. So not only do we get piping plovers using Napatree in the area, but we get a lot of migrants using the area as well too. So that's kind of my plover's perspective to Napatree, and I hope you learned something about these amazing birds. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you so much for your insightful answers, and thank you for an awesome presentation. Please join me in a big round of applause for Dr. Payton.
Thank you very much.